Morning, everyone. Welcome to one more episode of the Nova Journal Club. We had reviewed the international evidence-based guideline for the assessment and management of polycystic ovarian syndrome last time. We had reviewed the first part of this guideline. Today, we will move to the second part of these guidelines, which relates more to the management of infertility patients. For people who may not have logged in last time, what this guideline gives is recommendations in three categories. One is an evidence-based recommendation where there is sufficient evidence to form an informed recommendation. Second is the clinical consensus recommendation where there is no clinical evidence, but a clinical consensus has been recommended by this particular group. And the third is a clinical practice point where evidence is not sought, but a practice point has been made by this development group where certain important issues were involved when they met to develop these guidelines. So we had discussed the first four aspects during the first episode. Today we will look at screening, diagnostic assessment, and management of infertility in women with polycystic ovarian syndrome. We first start with assessment of risk factors that may affect fertility or its treatment response or to the pregnancy outcome. What this guideline tells is that certain risk factors which are known to impact fertility and the response to ART treatment are a BMI of less than 18 or more than 25, a higher waist-hip ratio, smokers, alcohol consumption, use of drugs, untreated sexually transmitted diseases, nutritional status, and vitamin D, folic acid deficiency, and other mental health conditions. The guideline also acknowledges that women with PCOS are at an increased risk when they become pregnant for development of gestational diabetes, preterm birth, preeclampsia, miscarriages, stillbirth, poor embryo development, reduced implantation rate, OHSS, and ectopic pregnancy. And all this could be exacerbated by obesity. So what this recommends is, again, as clinical practice points, that if there are factors like blood glucose, weight, blood pressure, this should be corrected or the patient should be counseled for optimizing this before any treatment is initiated. And these women, when they become pregnant, they should be monitored carefully given the increased risk of adverse maternal and offspring outcomes. Let us start with the recommendations for diagnosis and testing. The first issue is tubal patency testing. And the question here is, should women with PCOS and infertility due to anovulation alone and having a normal semen analysis, should these patients be offered a tubal testing prior to starting ovulation induction, either with intercourse or with an IUI, or one can delay the tubal patency testing? If we look at literature, there is no evidence to support that the incidence of either hydrosalpinx or any other fallopian tube disorder is more commoner in women with PCOS as opposed to the general population. So based on this, in spite of this, tubal patency is considered as an essential part of infertility workup, as has been outlined by this WHO report. And tubal patency testing should be considered whenever it is clinically appropriate. For example, in patients with previous abdominal or pelvic sepsis, previous surgery, recurrent acute pelvic pain, history of either sexually transmitted or other pelvic inflammatory disorders, or evidence of endometriosis. So what this group recommends is that in women with PCOS and infertility due to anovulation alone with a normal semen analysis, one should weigh the risk, benefit, cost, and the timing of tubal patency on an individual basis. And whenever there is a suspicion of tubal factor infertility, this patient should be subjected to a tubal testing. In essence, women having PCOS should be treated as all other normal infertile women, in the sense that tubal patency testing should be advised whenever there is a genuine indication. We then start off with how do you induce ovulation in these patients with PCOS. There are certain basic principles which need to be followed. It is important to know that the use of ovulation-inducing agents like aromatase inhibitors, metformin, or clomiphene is off-label in some countries. And whenever such off-label use of these drugs is prescribed, we need to inform the patient accordingly. Secondly, a pregnancy needs to be excluded prior to ovulation induction because these women have menstrual problems. And lastly, unsuccessful prolonged use of ovulation induction agents should be avoided because their success rates are not beyond a certain point. Having said this, let us start with individual ovulation induction agents. The first ones that are studied are letrozole. The question here is, in women with PCOS, are aromatase inhibitors effective for improving fertility outcomes? They have compared aromatase inhibitors in numerous scenarios. The first comparison is of aromatase inhibitors with a placebo. It is obvious that letrozole was better than a placebo. However, there was no difference between letrozole and placebo for pregnancy rate per patient and live birth rate per. The second was aromatase inhibitors with clomiphene. 13 RCTs compared letrozole with clomiphene. What was the conclusion was that letrozole was better than clomiphene for ovulation rate per patient, pregnancy rate per patient, and live birth rate per patient. And there was no difference between letrozole and clomiphene if we compared multiple pregnancy and miscarriage. Aromatase inhibitors versus clomiphene and metformin. Again, no statistical difference between letrozole and CC plus metformin in either of these parameters. What about aromatase inhibitors comparing to laparoscopic ovarian drilling? Again, no statistical difference in the pregnancy rates, multiple pregnancy rate, or miscarriage rate when you compare aromatase inhibitors with laparoscopic ovarian drilling. So what this guideline group recommended is that letrozole should be considered as the first-line pharmacological treatment for ovulation induction in women with PCOS with anovulation and having no other infertility factors. Where letrozole is not available or it is not permitted, then one should proceed with other ovulation induction drugs. And we should counsel the patient that the risk of multiple pregnancy appears to be less with letrozole compared to clomiphene citrate. Women with PCOS are significantly more likely to both ovulate and to have a live birth after the use of letrozole compared to clomiphene. And the likelihood of live birth rate increases by 40 to 60% when compared with clomiphene alone. Similarly, failure to ovulate, that is letrozole resistance, is also lower as compared to clomiphene resistance. The second drug which has been studied is clomiphene citrate, either alone or in combination with metformin. And the question here is clomiphene alone, metformin alone better than clomiphene? What is the role of clomiphene? And secondly, what about the role of these drugs in women who have high BMI of more than 32? When we compared metformin versus clomiphene citrate, metformin versus placebo, metformin was obviously better than a placebo. But when they compared metformin with clomiphene citrate, there was no statistically significant difference in metformin and clomiphene for live birth. Second is clomiphene citrate, that is metformin versus metformin and clomiphene citrate. And here it was found that metformin plus clomiphene citrate was better than metformin alone for ovulation rate, pregnancy rate, and live birth. What about clomiphene versus clomiphene and metformin? Again, metformin plus clomiphene was statistically significantly better than clomiphene alone in terms of pregnancy rate per participant and ovulation rate, but there was no difference in the live birth rate per pregnancy or the multiple pregnancy rate or the miscarriage rate when you compared clomiphene with clomiphene and metformin. What about clomiphene citrate with aromatase inhibitors? We had studied this earlier that letrozole was superior than clomiphene for all the parameters, ovulation rate, pregnancy rate, and the live birth. This is an interesting comparison looking at clomiphene citrate and or metformin comparing with gonadotropins alone or gonadotropins plus clomiphene. And here, the clinical pregnancy rate was significantly higher in the gonadotropin group as opposed to the clomiphene alone. What this committee came out in terms of guideline was that clomiphene citrate could be used alone in women with PCOS. Metformin could be used alone in PCOS with having no other factors, although the woman should be informed that there are more effective ovulation inducing drugs. Clomiphene should be used in preference when considering clomiphene citrate or metformin in women who are obese. If metformin is being used for ovulation induction in PCOS patients who are obese, there are no other infertility factors. Clomiphene should be added in these obese women. Clomiphene could be combined with metformin rather than persisting with clomiphene alone in patients who are clomiphene resistant, and there is a risk of multiple pregnancy in clomiphene citrate, and hence careful monitoring should be. We then move on to the use of gonadotropins. The question here is, in women with PCOS, are gonadotropins effective for improving their fertility outcome? There are two RCTs. Meta-analysis of these two RCTs found that gonadotropins were better than clomiphene alone for birth rate and ongoing pregnancy rate. What about gonadotropin versus clomiphene and metformin, or gonadotropin versus gonadotropin plus metformin? Does co-administration of metformin help? First, FSH was better than clomiphene plus metformin. However, if you look at live birth rate per participant, there was no statistical significance. And FSH plus metformin was better than FSH alone for live birth rate, based on this. What about gonadotropin compared to laparoscopic ovarian drilling? No difference between the interventions in terms of live birth rate, pregnancy rate, or miscarriage rate. Both are equally effective. Gonadotropins versus gonadotropin and clomiphene citrate. FSH plus CC was better than FSH alone, but no statistical difference between the two interventions for pregnancy rate and the. So the recommendations for the use of gonadotropin are: one, this should be used as a second-line pharmacological agents in patients who have failed the first line and have no other infertility factors. It could also be considered as the first line in the presence of ultrasound monitoring, following counseling on the cost and the potential risk of multiple pregnancy in women with PCOS. Whenever gonadotropins are available and affordable, they should be used in preference to clomiphene citrate combined with metformin therapy to improve the ovulation and the live birth rates. Gonadotropins with the addition of metformin could be used rather than gonadotropins alone, and either gonadotropins or laparoscopic surgery both have equal results. This should be decided based on the benefit-risk ratio for each particular therapy. We then move on to anti-obesity drugs. And in women with PCOS, what is the role of these anti-obesity drugs to improve fertility outcomes? It is recommended that pharmacological anti-obesity drugs should be considered an experimental therapy with risk to benefit ratios currently too uncertain to advocate this as a fertility therapy. So we need more evidence before we prescribe anti-obesity pharmaceutical drugs as a means for improving fertility. What about the role of laparoscopic ovarian surgery? Is it effective in improving fertility outcome? So what this group recommends is that laparoscopic ovarian surgery could be the second line therapy for women with PCOS. It should also be potentially offered as first line if laparoscopy is indicated for any other reason and there are no other infertility factors. And it is important that the risks of ovarian drilling should be explained to all the patients before this intervention because one, it is an invasive procedure, and second, there is a small but a definite risk of reduction in ovarian reserve or even complete loss of ovarian function, and there is a risk of adhesion formation. We then move on to the role of IVF in patients with polycystic ovarian syndrome. So there are interestingly no RCTs which compared stimulated IVF ICSI versus other ovulation induction drugs. So in the absence, what this guideline recommended was that in the absence of an absolute indication for IVF, women with PCOS and anovulation, IVF should be offered as the third line of therapy when the first or the second line of ovulation inductions have failed. However, it should also be recommended that in anovulatory PCOS, use of IVF is effective, especially when single embryo transfer is carried out because the risk of multiple pregnancies can be diminished. Patients with PCOS undergoing IVF need to be counseled about the availability, cost, and convenience, an increased risk of ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, and the options that are available to reduce this risk of ovarian hyperstimulation. If you offer IVF in patients with PCOS undergoing IVF, is the gonadotropin releasing hormone antagonist protocol or agonist protocol the most effective one for fertility outcomes? And here we are looking at the efficacy or the pregnancy outcomes, and there are 8 RCTs which suggest that there was a statistically significant decrease in the amount of gonadotropin required, duration of gonadotropin use, and in the OHSS group in the antagonist protocol versus the agonist protocol. And there was no significant difference in the pregnancy rate or the miscarriage rate. So the efficacy is the same, but the requirement of the drugs and the risk of OHSS is significantly lower. So what were the recommendations of this group was that a gonadotropin releasing hormone antagonist protocol is preferred in women with PCOS over the agonist protocol to reduce the duration of stimulation, the dose of stimulation, and the incidence of OHSS. Human chorionic gonadotropin is best used at the lowest dose to trigger the final oocyte maturation to reduce the incidence of OHSS. Triggering of this final maturation with an agonist with a freeze-all strategy of embryos would be considered in women having an increased risk of developing ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome when a fresh embryo transfer is not formed. And all women with PCOS, consideration should be given to an elective all freeze all of their cycles. What about the trigger type? Should it be the HCG or the agonist? The choice of trigger of agonist versus HCG is important because in the prevention of OHSS, because it is only the HCG which is associated with the risk of OHSS. Agonist triggers, however, are associated with a lower pregnancy rate, especially when you are contemplating a fresh embryo transfer, and this can be overcome by doing an all freeze followed by a frozen embryo. The choice of the gonadotropin that can be given to these women with PCOS, should it be FSH or should it be any other drug? The recommendation is that urinary and recombinant FSH can be used in PCOS. There is insufficient evidence to recommend one specific type of FSH preparation. What about the role of exogenous LH in the IVF stimulation? The recommendation is that exogenous recombinant LH should not be routinely used in combination with FSH in women having adjunct metformin. What this, if at all, the benefit of metformin in IVF cycles in women with? There was no evidence in this particular Cochrane meta-analysis that addition of metformin, whether it has any benefit on live birth rate, miscarriage rate, number of eggs received, days of stimulation, or the cancellation rate. The recommendation is that adjunct metformin therapy could be used before and or during the stimulation protocol. The recommendation is could be used, not it should be used. And second, in an agonist protocol with a metformin therapy, the following should be considered: that it commenced at the start of the agonist. It should be used at doses between 1 gram to 2.5 grams. It should be stopped at the time of the pregnancy test or metformin, and one should be counseled for the metformin-induced. Lastly, about the issue of in vitro maturity. Now, in vitro maturation of oocytes limits or completely omits ovarian stimulation prior to oocyte retrieval, with the maturation of oocytes happening post pickup, and thereby completely avoiding the risk of ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. However, there are not many relevant randomized controlled trials. So if you look at the evidence from the retrospective studies, it suggests that IVM is similarly successful for a live birth with frozen embryo transfer as that generated by the standard IVM. However, the recommendations are that the term IVM is applied to maturation in vitro of an immature cumulus oocyte complex collected from the entrant follicles. And in units with sufficient expertise, IVM could be offered to achieve pregnancy and live birth rates approaching those of standard IVF without the risk of birth. So the recommendation is it should be offered only at clinics with sufficient. To summarize, for the infertility management of PCOS, the first line is letrozole or clomiphene citrate. Metformin can be added, which is especially beneficial to women having a BMI above 30. The second line is gonadotropins. The third line is laparoscopic ovarian surgery, where one should explain the risk of both surgical procedure and the loss of ovarian reserve. The last step, but the most effective step, is IVF ICSI, or when experience exists in vitro maturation of. Thank you all for this. Before we move on